What's war? I warned you before.
Angel Sharman had one simple rule. If Dorian Esposito thought he could ignore the chemistry between them because of an arranged engagement, she'd prove him wrong. And nothing said impossible to ignore better than a tight green dress, plunging neckline, and showing up at his club. She knew he'd be there, and she also knew he'd see her, and exactly what would happen next. Dorian Esposito couldn't resist a challenge. And Angel? She was a master at challenging him. And I'm Lena, the creator of this channel. Right now on screen, I'm showing you the comments from Deborah and Elman. Thank you so much for the compliments, everyone. But before we continue, answer me something. What do you think about someone who fights for a man knowing he's getting married against his will? Tell me down below, and maybe your comment will show up in the next video. Chapter 1. Green Dress and Warning.
You can't ignore me.
I knew exactly what I was doing when I chose the emerald green dress hanging in the closet. It was my secret weapon. The tight fabric hugged every curve of my body like a second skin, and the V neckline plunged in a way that bordered on obscene without ever crossing the line. Dorian Esposito wouldn't be able to ignore this. Henri was sitting on my bed, legs crossed as he watched me spin in front of the mirror with that expression of someone watching the best reality show of his life. "Girl, this dress is going to be a crime for him," he said, and I could hear the obvious approval in his voice. That tone he always used when he knew I was about to do something completely insane and absolutely necessary. "Dorian's going to have a heart attack when he sees you." "That's exactly what I want," I replied, adjusting the neckline one more time and feeling the fabric slide against my skin in a way that made me feel powerful and dangerous at the same time. Deb was leaning against my bedroom doorframe, arms crossed, and that worried expression she always had when I was about to dive headfirst into something she considered potentially self-destructive. "Angel, Dorian's going to completely lose it," Deb said, her voice loaded with genuine concern that I knew came from a place of love, even if I didn't want to hear it. "You know he gets possessive, and he has no right to be possessive because he's practically engaged to Greta." I stopped looking at myself in the mirror and turned to face her, feeling that familiar wave of stubbornness rise through my chest like a tide I couldn't control. "Practically isn't actually engaged," I said, and even I could hear the defiance in my own voice. "And until he officially marries that cold snake, I have every right to play whatever game I want to play." Henri clapped dramatically, that exaggerated gesture he always made when he approved of my most questionable decisions. "Exactly. You two are complete idiots who won't admit you desperately want each other, so someone has to force the situation, and that someone is you in that devastating dress. We can't want each other," I murmured, more to myself than to them, as I grabbed my small purse and checked if I had everything I needed for the night. "The families are incompatible, the worlds are completely different, and he has Greta waiting for him with a marriage contract already signed by the families. And you have that dress," Henri retorted, getting up from the bed and coming over to me to adjust a strand of my hair that had fallen out of place. "You killed it, girl. Let's end him once and for all." The office on the upper floor of Eclipse was a sanctuary of understated luxury and silent power, with dark glass that offered a perfect view of everything happening on the dance floor below, while keeping the occupants completely hidden from curious eyes. Dorian was sitting at the dark mahogany desk, surrounded by 3 of his closest associates, discussing territory numbers and issues that demanded his attention, even when his mind was anywhere but there. The meeting was dragging and tedious, full of details that Dorian would normally process with ease, but that today seemed to slide through his mind without leaving any mark. He was restless in a way that rarely happened, that strange feeling that something was about to happen, but he didn't know exactly what. The office door opened without warning, and one of the guards entered with that urgent expression that immediately put everyone in the room on alert. "Boss," the guard said, and Dorian could hear something in his voice that made him straighten in his chair instantly. Angel Sharman just arrived downstairs with her friends. Dorian felt his heart race in a way that was completely inconvenient and totally out of his control. That visceral reaction he always had when it came to her. He kept his expression neutral, controlled, even when everything inside him was starting to boil. "And?" he asked, the tone too casual to be true. The guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. "She's different today, boss. Green dress, pretty eye-catching. She's getting a lot of attention on the floor." Dorian felt his jaw lock automatically, that familiar tension taking over his body as he processed the words. Green. She was wearing green, and he knew without needing to see that it would be the kind of green that clung to her body and made every man in the club look twice. "Understood," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "You can leave. The meeting's over." The associates exchanged confused looks but didn't question, getting up and leaving the office in silence while the guard followed behind them. Dorian was alone, and immediately his hands went to the security camera remote, his fingers flying over the buttons until he found the angle showing the main dance floor, and there she was, Angel Sharman in all her provocative glory, wearing an emerald green dress that should be illegal. The fabric hugged every curve of hers in a way that made Dorian grip the glass of whiskey on the desk so hard he almost broke the glass. She was dancing, laughing, completely free, and absolutely devastating. And Dorian could see the way half the men on the floor were looking at her with interest that was way too obvious. "She's testing me," Dorian murmured to himself, eyes fixed on the screen as Angel spun, and the dress moved with her in a hypnotizing way. She knows exactly what she's doing. Eclipse was exactly the kind of place you'd expect a mob boss disguised as a legitimate businessman to own. All understated luxury and music loud enough to drown out conversations that shouldn't be heard. The lights flickered in shades of deep blue and purple, and the city's elite mingled on the dance floor as if they didn't have a care in the world, completely oblivious to the shady business happening in the offices upstairs. Henri nudged me with his elbow as we entered the club, and I could feel the stares turning in our direction, specifically in my direction, and I knew the dress was doing exactly the job I had planned. "Half the club is already looking at you," Henri whispered in my ear with that tone of obvious satisfaction, and I smiled because that was exactly what I wanted. That attention I knew would eventually reach Dorian one way or another. Deb discreetly pointed upstairs, to that dark glass of the VIP office, where I knew Dorian spent most of his time when he was at the club. "He's up there, and I bet you anything he already knows you're here. Look up. He's watching you." I looked up, at that glass that didn't let me see anything but that I knew from the other side offered a perfect view of everything happening below, and I smiled in that way I knew was provocative and completely intentional. If Dorian was watching me, and I was absolutely certain he was, then I was going to put on a show he'd never forget. We blended into the floor, and I let the music take over my body, dancing in a way I knew drew attention without being vulgar, just enough to be impossible to ignore. Henri was beside me, making hilarious comments about half the people in the club, and Deb was trying to relax, even though I could see the worry still present in her eyes. That's when the man approached, a guy I'd never seen before, with that overly confident smile of someone who wasn't used to hearing no. "Hi, can I buy you a drink?" he asked, and his hand was already reaching out to touch my arm in a way that made me want to pull back immediately. "Thanks, but no need," I replied with firm politeness, trying to move away without creating a scene, but he didn't get the message, or simply chose to ignore it. "Come on, just one drink," he insisted, and this time his hand actually touched my arm, his fingers squeezing slightly in a way that made my stomach turn with discomfort. And then Dorian appeared out of nowhere, as if he had simply materialized out of thin air beside me, and his voice was pure ice when he spoke. "She said no, so you leave now." The man looked at Dorian, and I saw the exact moment he recognized who was in front of him, the instant fear that took over his features, as if someone had thrown cold water in his face. "Sorry, boss. I didn't know she's nothing of mine," Dorian cut him off, and I could feel the tension radiating from him even without looking directly, that dangerous energy he always carried like a second skin. "But you're in my club, and I'm telling you to leave now before I lose my patience." The man practically ran away from us, and I turned to face Dorian for the first time since he'd come down from that office. And God, he was exactly as I remembered, and even more intense up close. The dark suit hugged his body in a way that should be illegal, and his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made the air leave my lungs all at once. "Hi, Dorian," I said, and even to my own ears my tone sounded too provocative, that small smile forming on my lips without me being able to control it. "Didn't know you were here." "Liar," he replied immediately, and his eyes took a slow and deliberate path over my body, lingering on the neckline before returning to my face with an expression that mixed desire and irritation in equal parts. "You knew exactly I was here, and that's why you came dressed like this." "Like what?" I asked with false innocence, tilting my head slightly in a way I knew made my hair fall over my shoulder seductively. "It's just a dress. It's a provocation," Dorian corrected, taking a step closer to me, so close I could feel the heat from his body and the smell of the expensive cologne he always wore. "And you know exactly what you're doing." Henri was beside me with Deb, and I could practically feel the huge smile on his face when he whispered low enough for only Deb to hear, but I still managed to catch it. "The sexual tension here is so palpable I could cut it with a knife." Dorian didn't take his eyes off me, and I could see his jaw locking in that way I already knew, that sign that he was fighting his own self-control with all the strength he had. "You're playing a dangerous game, Angel." "I'm not playing anything," I replied, and it was a complete lie. but I didn't care one bit. I'm just enjoying the show at your club, and is that a problem for you? The problem is that half the men here are looking at you like you're something they could have, Dorian said, his voice low and loaded with a possessiveness he had no right to feel. But that still made me feel a dangerous heat spread through my body, and I don't like sharing what's mine. I raised an eyebrow, challenging him even knowing I was playing with fire. I'm not yours, Dorian. You have Greta, remember? Your perfect, almost fiancé who's waiting for you? His jaw locked even tighter, and I could see the frustration burning in those dark eyes. Greta is complicated, then uncomplicate it, I said, crossing my arms and feeling the dress fabric stretch against my body in a way I knew was drawing his attention again. Or leave me alone once and for all. I try to leave you alone, Dorian replied, and there was a raw honesty in his voice that caught me off guard. You're the one who won't let me, showing up here dressed like this and expecting me to just ignore it. Then stop looking, I provoked, knowing I was poking the lion but unable to stop. Dorian laughed, but it was a sound with no humor at all, a dangerous sound that made my skin prickle. Impossible. You know it's completely impossible. The music changed to something slower, and the moment between us became even more charged, that electricity in the air that always existed when we were too close to each other. Dorian extended his hand, and I could see the war happening in his eyes, that internal struggle between what he wanted and what he knew was right. Dance with me, he said, and it wasn't exactly a request. It was almost a soft command wrapped in temptation. Why? I asked, even though I already knew I was going to accept, that I always accepted when it came to him. Because if you're going to provoke, then at least do it under my supervision, Dorian replied, his finger still extended in my direction. Where I can control who touches you. I put my hand in his, feeling that familiar shock of electricity that always happened when our skin touched. Controlling. You haven't seen anything yet, he murmured, pulling me onto the dance floor and closer to him than was strictly necessary. Dorian's hands found my waist, his fingers spreading possessively against the thin fabric of the dress, and I could feel his heat burning through the clothing as if there were no barrier between us. My hands went to his shoulders, and we moved together in a way that was far more intimate than any dance should be in public. You look beautiful, Dorian said, his voice low and husky near my ear, so close I could feel the warm air from his breath against my skin. Devastatingly beautiful, and completely forbidden. Then why are you holding me like this? I asked, tilting my head to look at him, at those dark eyes that always made me feel like I was falling without a safety net. Because I'm weak when it comes to you, Dorian admitted, and there was a vulnerability in those words that hit me in the chest like a punch, and you know exactly that and use it against me. Dorian, I started, but he cut me off before I could continue. We stayed once, he said, and I knew exactly what he was talking about. That kiss a year ago, that had almost turned into much more, before reality pulled us back. A year ago, just a kiss, but I think about it every day since then. I felt my heart race, beating so hard, I was sure he could feel it against his chest. Me too, I admitted, because there was no point lying when we were this close, when I could see the truth reflected in his eyes. Then why don't we, Dorian started, but it was my turn to interrupt him. Because you're going to marry Greta, I said, and each word hurt to come out. Because my family would kill me if they knew, because we're completely impossible in all the ways that matter. What if I didn't care about impossible? He asked, his hand squeezing my waist in a way that was almost desperate. But you do care, I replied, forcing myself to be the voice of reason, even when everything in me just wanted to dive in head first and forget all the consequences. Your family needs this alliance with the Moreaus, and my family... My father would disown me if he knew I was here dancing with you right now. Your father doesn't know half the things you do, Dorian said with a small, dangerous smile. And it's staying that way, I confirmed. But I didn't move away from him. Couldn't move away even knowing I should. The music ended, but Dorian didn't release me immediately. His fingers still pressed against my waist, as if he couldn't force himself to let me go. Leave, Angel, he finally said, but his voice was loaded with reluctance. Now, before I do something we'll both regret. Like what? I challenged, knowing I was provoking again but unable to stop. Like taking you to my office and showing you exactly what this dress does to me, Dorian replied, and the raw honesty in his words made me feel like the ground had disappeared from under my feet. I felt a shiver run down my entire spine, that kind of dangerous heat spreading through my body. Is that a threat or a promise? Both, he said, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that left me breathless. Please, leave now. I pulled away, feeling the loss of his warmth immediately, but before leaving completely, I came back to whisper close enough for only him to hear. Meet me outside in 10 minutes, in the parking lot. And then I left, feeling his eyes burning on my back with every step I took. I was leaning against my car when Dorian came out of the club, and I could tell by the way he walked that whatever self-control he'd maintained inside had been completely abandoned. He came straight to me with that absolute determination that made my heart beat uncontrollably, and before I could say anything, his hands were on my waist again, pulling me against him and pressing me gently but firmly against the car. "If I catch you wearing this dress again," Dorian said, his voice husky and loaded with dangerous promise, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me forget how to breathe, "I'll rip it off you with my teeth, and I don't care one bit who's watching." I laughed, and even to me the sound came out provocative and loaded with challenge. "Is that a promise?" "It's a warning," Dorian corrected, getting even closer, so close I could feel the heat from his body against mine, and his breath mixing with mine. "What if I wear it again just to test?" I provoked, unable to leave things alone even knowing I was playing with something too dangerous. "Then you find out if I'm bluffing or not," he replied, and I could feel the tension vibrating between us like a stretched wire about to snap. I touched his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast under my palm. "You never bluff, Dorian." "No," he agreed, his voice coming out tense, "especially not when it comes to you." He paused, and I could see the struggle happening in his eyes. "This is complete madness." "I know," I agreed, but I didn't pull away. "We can't do this," he said, but his hands were still on my waist, still holding me against him. "I know," I repeated, feeling my heart beating so hard it hurt. "But I want you," Dorian admitted, the words coming out like a confession torn by force. "God, I want you so much it scares me." "Then have me," I said, the words coming out before I could think better of them. Dorian closed his eyes for a moment, and I could see the last remnant of control being tested to the limit. "Not here, not like this," he finally said, opening his eyes to look at me with a tenderness that completely contrasted with the intensity from before. "You deserve better than a parking lot." "Dorian," I started, but he interrupted me by kissing my forehead, a gesture so gentle and unexpected it made my chest tighten. "Go home," he said, pulling away with what seemed like immense effort. "Before I lose all the reason I have left." I stood still for a moment, just looking at him, before finally agreeing. "Okay, but this isn't over by a long shot." "It never ends with you," Dorian said, and there was a resigned acceptance in his voice, as if he had finally admitted something he'd been denying for a long time. I got in the car, feeling my hands shaking slightly as I turned on the ignition, and when I looked in the rearview mirror before leaving, Dorian was still standing there, watching me drive away with an expression I couldn't completely decipher. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was just beginning. Chapter 2. Game begins and towel accident.
Is it working?
Yeah, it looks like it.
Good.
Don't worry.
I wasn't there, but Henri told me every miserable detail afterwards, and my imagination filled in the rest with a painful clarity I'd rather not have. Dorian was sitting in one of the city's most expensive restaurants, surrounded by the two families that were about to unite through a contract they had the audacity to call a marriage. The table was impeccably set with expensive crystal and silver cutlery, everything screaming luxury and power, but none of it mattered when you were trapped in a conversation about your own future without having any choice. Greta was sitting beside him, smiling in that way I'd already learned to recognize as completely fake, that perfect mask of a happy bride she wore to hide the cold calculator she really was underneath. Dorian's father was at the head of the table, discussing the details of the alliance as if he were negotiating any commercial contract, because at the end of the day, that's exactly what it was. "Wedding in 3 months," Dorian's father announced with that authoritative voice that didn't accept questions, raising his wineglass in a toast that felt more like a decree. "The alliance between the Esposito and Moreau families will finally be solidified." Dorian murmured something that sounded like agreement, but Henri told me you could see in his eyes that he was completely bored, completely disconnected from everything happening around him. Greta placed her hand over his on the table, that possessive and performative gesture that was more for the audience than for him. "It'll be perfect, darling," Greta said, with that saccharine tone that probably fooled everyone except Dorian, and I could perfectly imagine the way he discreetly withdrew his hand from hers, creating distance without making a scene. "Yes," Dorian replied, his voice neutral and controlled the way he always was when forcing himself to do something he hated. 3 days had dragged by since that night at Eclipse. 3 days where I tried and miserably failed not to think about Dorian every second that passed. Henry was on my couch that Thursday night when he dropped the bomb, his eyes glued to his phone as he scrolled through some gossip source I didn't even question anymore. "Girl, he's there right now," Henry said. And I didn't need to ask who he was because there was only one person who mattered in that context. With her, at the family dinner, planning the wedding somewhere ridiculously expensive, I felt my stomach turn, that horrible combination of jealousy and helplessness settling in my chest like a physical weight. "I know," I said, forcing my voice to come out more controlled than I actually felt. Deb was beside me on the couch, her hand finding mine in a gesture of silent support. Are you okay, Angel? No, I admitted, because lying to them made no sense. But there's nothing I can do. He made his choice. Henri dropped his phone with that dramatic indignation that was his trademark. He didn't choose anything at all. He was forced by his family, by the alliance, by all these absurd mafia things. The result is the same, I said, feeling each word hurt to come out. He's getting married in 3 months and I lose him for good. Saturday morning arrived with Henri showing up at my door unannounced. That conspiratorial smile on his face that immediately put me on alert. You won't believe what I found out, he announced before even coming in, practically vibrating with excitement. What did you do, Henri? I asked, already knowing he'd stuck his nose where he shouldn't. Dorian's at the family beach house, Henri revealed triumphantly, throwing himself on my couch, as if he'd just discovered the secret of the universe. Alone, no guards, no one. My heart instantly raced. Alone? Completely, Henri confirmed, gesturing dramatically. Beautiful beach house, isolated, perfect for a surprise visit. Deb immediately shook her head. Angel, no. That's trespassing. You can't just show up there. It's not trespassing if he invites me, I said, already grabbing my phone with trembling hands. I typed and deleted the message 3 times before hitting send. Heard you're at the beach, alone, bored. The reply came so fast it almost startled me. Who told you? Sources, I replied, smiling. Can I come? I promised to behave. There was a pause before the next message appeared. Liar. You never behave. So that's a yes? I insisted. The final reply took longer, and I could imagine Dorian fighting with himself on the other side. Yes, come. The house was even more beautiful than I imagined, all in light tones with huge windows that framed the ocean perfectly. Dorian opened the door before I finished climbing the stairs, and the way he looked at me made all nervousness disappear. You came, he said, surprise and relief mixed in his voice. Said I would, I replied, entering with my small suitcase. Wow, this house is gorgeous. Family inheritance, Dorian explained, closing the door. I come here when I need to think. About Greta? I asked, turning to face him, his expression tensed. Among other things. Dorian, are you really going to marry her? I don't have a choice, he said, resignation weighing in his words. My family needs this alliance. And what do you want? I insisted. He looked at me with that intensity that always completely disarmed me. You know what I want, but I can't have it. The silence that settled was loaded with everything unsaid. Show me my room? I asked, breaking the moment. Second door on the left. Dorian indicated the hallway. He paused. I'm at the end of the hall, in case you need anything. I smiled provocatively. Noted. Discovering that Dorian cooked was a delicious surprise. The dinner he prepared was as good as the company was dangerous. We talked, laughed, shared stories while the connection between us intensified with each minute. Afterwards, we decided to watch a movie, settling on the couch with a respectable distance that gradually diminished. Our hands were dangerously close on the couch, almost touching but never completely, that electric tension vibrating in the air almost palpably. I'm going to take a shower, I said when the movie ended, getting up before doing something impulsive. Good night, Angel, he replied, and the way he said my name made my skin prickle. The plan formed while I was in the shower, that mischievous idea I knew was playing with fire but couldn't resist. I got out of the bath and wrapped myself in the smallest towel I'd brought, letting my wet hair fall over my shoulders while checking my reflection with a conspiratorial smile. I walked down the hallway to his slightly open bedroom door, my heart beating uncontrollably. I knocked softly. Dorian, do you have conditioner? I forgot mine. There's some in the master bathroom. His voice came casually from inside. You can grab it. I pushed the door and entered. The moment Dorian turned and saw me was absolutely delicious. He froze completely, his eyes widening as they traveled over my body, wrapped only in the small towel, skin still damp, and water droplets running down my neck. Angel, he started, his voice strangled. Sorry, I said with exaggerated innocence, letting my eyes travel over his bare torso. Didn't know you were like this, and you're like that, Dorian replied, his jaw locking as he fought some intense internal battle. It's just a towel, I said casually, walking to the master bathroom and feeling the towel ride up slightly. I just got out of the shower. Angel, you're playing, Dorian said behind me, absolute tension in his voice. I grabbed the conditioner and came back, passing dangerously close to him. Playing what? That's when the towel slipped slightly, just enough that I had to grab it quickly, but not before almost showing more than I should. Dorian's hands grabbed my arm gently but firmly, stopping my movement. Stop, he ordered, his voice husky. Stop what? I asked with false innocence. You know exactly what, Dorian said, pointing at me. This towel. Here, in my room. Sorry, it was an accident. I started, but he interrupted me with a humorless laugh. It wasn't, Dorian said, releasing me. Nothing with you is an accident. You plan, provoke, test my control on purpose. I took a step closer, completely invading his personal space. And is it working? Very much, Dorian admitted, his voice husky. But I won't. I can't. He pulled away with visible effort. Go to your room now, please. I agreed, walking to the door, but stopped in the doorway to turn and look at him. Dorian, you have a lot of self-control. Impressive. I left, leaving him alone with his thoughts and self-control tested to the limit. I could swear I heard him whisper something when I closed the door, something that sounded like pure frustration, but I pretended not to have heard while returning to my room with a satisfied smile on my lips. The game had officially begun, and I was just warming up. Chapter 3: Jealousy and Greta Attacks.
We won't run anymore.
Sunday dawned with an impossible blue sky and the sound of waves crashing on the sand in a way that seemed almost hypnotizing, and I woke up with the strange feeling that something had changed during the night, as if that purposeful towel accident had broken some invisible barrier between Dorian and me. I went down to the kitchen wearing beach shorts and a light tank top, my hair still messy from sleep, and found Dorian already awake making coffee with that thoughtful expression I was starting to recognize. "Good morning," I said, and he turned with a small smile that made my stomach do that familiar flip. "Good morning," Dorian replied, pushing a cup of coffee in my direction. "Sleep well?" "Perfectly," I lied, because actually I'd spent most of the night replaying that moment in his room and wondering what would have happened if he'd completely lost control. The way Dorian looked at me told me he knew exactly I was lying, but he didn't comment, just sipped his own coffee with that amused expression in his eyes. We spent the entire morning on the private beach behind the house, and it was surreal how everything seemed easy and natural when we were alone like this, away from the families and expectations, and all the complexity that normally surrounded anything we had. We swam in the ocean with the cold water making my skin prickle, and Dorian taught me to catch smaller waves while we laughed when I fell and swallowed salt water. At some point in the afternoon, we were lying on the sand letting the sun dry our skin, so close I could feel the heat from his body radiating in my direction. Dorian turned on his side to look at me, propping himself up on his elbow, and the way he watched me made my heart race dangerously. "What?" I asked, turning my head to face him. "Nothing," Dorian said, but there was something in his voice that told me it wasn't nothing. I was just thinking that this moment is the closest to peace I've felt in a long time. I felt something tighten in my chest, that mixture of happiness and sadness, because I knew this moment was temporary, that eventually we'd have to return to reality where he was promised to someone else. Dorian leaned closer, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that made the rest of the world disappear completely, and I could feel his breath mixing with mine as the space between us decreased more and more. Our lips were centimeters apart when Dorian stopped, that internal war visible in his eyes before he pulled away with a frustrated sigh. "Sorry," he murmured, getting up and extending his hand to help me. "Let's go back to the house." That repeated itself 2 more times during the day, those charged moments where something almost happened, but we always stopped at the last second, always pulling back before crossing that line we both knew would be impossible to come back from after crossing. The second time was in the kitchen while we were preparing lunch together, Dorian accidentally cornering me against the counter while reaching for something behind me, our faces dangerously close before he quickly pulled away, murmuring an apology. The third time was at the end of the afternoon, when we were sitting on the wooden deck watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, my head resting on his shoulder in a way that felt as natural as breathing. Dorian turned his face to look at me, his hand coming up to touch my face gently, and I could see surrender beginning to take over his expression, before some thought pulled him back to reality, and he pulled away again. "Why do you keep stopping?" I finally asked, unable to hold back the frustration any longer. "Because if I start," Dorian said, his voice husky and loaded with contained emotion, "I won't be able to stop." What neither of us knew was that someone had photographed us during that day on the beach. Some sneaky paparazzi hidden somewhere with a lens powerful enough to capture moments that should have remained private. The photo showed Dorian and me on the sand, dangerously close, laughing at some joke I didn't even remember anymore, and the intimacy between us was too obvious to be denied or explained as anything other than what it really was. Greta's call came a few hours later, when we'd already returned inside the house, and were preparing dinner together in that comfortable atmosphere that had developed between us. Dorian's phone rang, and I saw his expression change completely when he looked at the screen, that mask of control instantly settling in while he answered, and put it on speakerphone without realizing it, or maybe purposely. "Who is she?" Greta's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, and I froze in place where I was cutting vegetables. "No one," Dorian replied, his voice carefully neutral. "A friend." "Photos say otherwise," Greta retorted, and I could hear the cold anger behind the calculated words. "You two look very intimate in those photos, Dorian." "Greta, it's nothing you need to," Dorian started, but she cut him off immediately. "I'm not an idiot, Dorian," Greta said, each word loaded with barely disguised venom. I know when a man is interested in someone, and you're interested in her. There was a deliberate pause, and when she continued, her voice had become even more dangerous. But remember one thing, our marriage is a contract, an alliance between families. If you break this contract, your family suffers the consequences, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. I saw Dorian close his eyes for a moment, his jaw locking hard. Understood. Great, Greta said with obvious satisfaction. Stay away from her, Dorian, or I'll make you stay away, and I guarantee you won't like my methods. The call ended abruptly, and the silence that settled in the kitchen was so heavy it felt physical. Dorian stood still for a long moment before finally turning to face me, and the pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. She threatened you, Dorian said, coming to where I was and bracing his hands on the counter hard enough to make his knuckles turn white. Greta's going to try to hurt you, Angel, and I can't let that happen. I'm not afraid of her, I said immediately, feeling that familiar stubbornness rising through my chest. You should be, Dorian insisted, his hands finding my shoulders in a gesture that was half protection and half desperation. Greta is dangerous when she wants to be. She has resources and connections that can really hurt you. And what do you want me to do? I asked, hating the tremor I managed to detect in my own voice. Just disappear from your life like none of this happened? Dorian closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was such deep pain in them it made me want to cry. Maybe we should stop this, he said, each word clearly hurting to come out. Whatever this is, it would be safer for you, easier for everyone. Do you want to stop? I asked, needing to hear his truth even if it hurt. No, Dorian admitted immediately, raw honesty in his voice. God, no, but I can't put you in danger because of something that can't have a future anyway. I pulled away from him, walking to the window overlooking the ocean while trying to process everything that was happening, all the conflicting emotions that were tearing my chest in half. What if we had 3 months? I finally asked, turning to face him with a desperate idea forming in my head. You said the wedding is in 3 months, right? Angel, Dorian started, but I interrupted him before he could speak. Give me those 3 months, Dorian, I said, walking back to him with determination. 3 months where we don't have to think about the future, where we can just be. And then, when you get married, I promise I'll move on and never bother you again. You think I'll be able to forget you after 3 months together? Dorian asked, his voice rough with emotion. I can barely forget you after 1 kiss a year ago. Then give me that memory, I insisted, placing my hands on his chest and feeling his heart beating strong and fast under my palms. Give me something to keep when all this is over. Dorian looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the battle happening in his eyes, the fight between what was right and what he desperately wanted. 3 months, he finally said, his hands coming up to hold my face with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity of the moment. 3 months that are ours. Secret. No one can know. Secret, I agreed, feeling tears starting to form in my eyes even as I smiled. But after that, Dorian continued, his thumb caressing my cheek softly, you need to promise me you'll move on, that you'll find someone who can really give you everything you deserve. I promise, I lied, because we both knew it was impossible to promise something like that when my heart already belonged completely to him. And then Dorian finally kissed me, and it was like the entire universe had aligned perfectly in that moment. It wasn't gentle or hesitant, it was desperate and intense, and loaded with all the feelings we'd been repressing for so long. His hands buried themselves in my hair as he pulled me closer, and I clung to his shoulders as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Dorian rested his forehead against mine and closed his eyes. This is going to end up destroying me, he murmured, but it didn't sound like a complaint. It sounded like an acceptance. Then at least we'll be destroyed together, I replied, and kissed him again, because now that it had started, I couldn't imagine stopping. 3 months, I thought as I lost myself in that kiss that seemed to rewrite my entire existence. 3 months to love him completely, before having to let him go forever. It seemed simultaneously like an eternity, and nowhere near enough time. So, do you think they'll be able to keep all this a secret? Chaos would happen if this comes to light. Chapter 4. Secret Relationship and Mom Suspects.
I can't lie anymore.
3 weeks had passed since that kiss at the beach house, and they were simultaneously the best and most torturous of my entire life. Dorian and I met in secret whenever we could, stealing moments in discreet hotels on the other side of the city where no one we knew would ever set foot, or at his house when he was absolutely certain there would be no unexpected interruptions. Each encounter was intense in a way that left me breathless, that combination of desperate passion and the constant awareness that all of this had an expiration date. We were careful, obsessively careful actually, always arriving and leaving places separately, never touching in public, keeping our conversations in encrypted messages that were deleted right after being read. It was exhausting to live this way, always looking over our shoulders and checking if anyone was paying too much attention. But the alternative was worse. It was not having Dorian at all, and that simply wasn't an option I could accept. Henri and Deb knew, of course, because it was impossible to hide something like this from the two people who knew me better than anyone in the world, but they kept the secret as if their own lives depended on it. Henri kept making jokes about how I was living a forbidden romance worthy of a soap opera, while Deb alternated between unconditional support and maternal concern about how all this was inevitably going to end up destroying me. "You're glowing," Henri commented on a Thursday afternoon when we met for coffee, his eyes scanning my face with that attention to detail that made him impossible to fool. "Like literally glowing, as if you'd swallowed a happiness light bulb." I smiled without being able to help it, feeling that familiar warmth rising through my cheeks. "I'm happy, I know you are," Deb said from across the table, but there was concern in her eyes even as she smiled. "I just hope you know what you're doing, because when this ends, and it will end, Angel, it's going to hurt a lot more than you're prepared to feel." She was right, of course. Deep down I knew she was completely right, but I chose to ignore that thought and focus only on the present, on those precious weeks I still had before everything crumbled. The problem with secrets, however, is that they have a way of leaking through the cracks, no matter how careful you are, and my mother had always had a frighteningly accurate intuition when it came to noticing when something was happening with me. It was during a family dinner on a Sunday that Margaret decided to confront the elephant in the room, or at least her version of the elephant she'd built based on observations she'd made about my behavior in recent weeks. We were in my parents' dining room, my father absorbed in some business conversation on the phone, while my mother and I set the table for lunch. "Angel," Margaret began with that casual tone that immediately put me on alert, because it meant she was about to ask a question that wasn't casual at all. "You've been different lately." "Different how?" I asked, keeping my voice light while arranging the silverware with unnecessary attention to detail. "Happier," she said, stopping arranging the wine glasses to look directly at me, "and at the same time more absent, like part of you is always somewhere else thinking about something else." I felt my stomach knot, that familiar panic starting to rise up my throat as I tried to formulate a response that would be convincing enough without being a complete lie. "It's work, Mom," I said, hating how my voice sounded too defensive. "I'm involved in a big project that's taking a lot of my time and energy." Margaret watched me for a long moment, those eyes that had seen me grow up processing every micro-expression on my face. "Are you seeing someone?" she finally asked, and the directness of the question caught me so off guard, I almost dropped the fork I was holding. "Why do you ask that?" I deflected, buying time while my mind raced for an adequate response. "Mother's intuition," Margaret replied with a small smile, but there was seriousness in her eyes that told me she wasn't going to let the subject die so easily. She paused, placing the last glass in its spot before continuing. "Is it someone appropriate, Angel? Someone your father would approve of?" The irony of that question almost made me laugh, because if there was one person in the entire world my father definitely wouldn't approve of, it would be exactly Dorian Esposito, mob boss disguised as a respectable businessman. "Yes," I lied, the word coming out more easily than it should considering it was completely false. "Very appropriate." Margaret continued watching me with that expression that told me she wasn't completely convinced, but fortunately she decided not to push further for now. "Okay," she finally said, returning her attention to the final details of the table. "But be careful, dear. Wrong men have a way of seeming completely right at the beginning, and it's only when you're already too involved that the truth starts to appear." I felt those words hit directly in the center of my chest, because she was right in ways she couldn't even imagine. She was so incredibly right it hurt to acknowledge. "I know, Mom," I said softly, and this time it wasn't a lie at all. That night, I met Dorian at the discreet hotel that had become our usual place, a boutique establishment on the other side of the city that asked minimal questions and accepted cash payment without complaint. He was already there when I arrived, waiting in the room with that expression that always became lighter the moment he saw me, as if my presence alone was enough to relieve some invisible weight he constantly carried. "Does your mom suspect anything?" I asked, after we settled on the small sofa near the window, my body fitting perfectly against his side, in a way that always made me feel like we'd been made for this. No, Dorian replied, his fingers tracing distracted patterns on my arm. She's completely focused on the wedding preparations with Greta, obsessed with every detail as if it were the event of the century. He paused, and I could feel the tension increasing in his muscles. 10 weeks left. I felt my heart squeeze painfully, that brutal reminder that our time was running out faster than I wanted to admit. Don't talk about that, I said, turning to face him and placing my hand on his face. Not now, not when we're here together. Sorry, Dorian murmured, turning his face to kiss my palm, before pulling me into a real kiss, slow and deep, and loaded with everything we couldn't say out loud. When we pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine and closed his eyes. You're all I think about, Angel. Every meeting, every conversation, every time Greta or my mother talks about the wedding, all I can think about is you. Even knowing this ends, I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. Even knowing that in 10 weeks you'll be married to her and I'll be just a memory? Dorian opened his eyes, and the intensity of his gaze hit me like a physical blow. Especially because of that, he admitted, the raw vulnerability in his voice making my heart break and mend at the same time. Every moment with you is precious. Exactly because it's temporary. Because I know that when it's over, I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I could come back here. I felt tears starting to form, that overwhelming emotion I'd been trying to keep under control finally overflowing. I love you, I said, the words coming out like a confession and a curse at the same time. I know I shouldn't. I know this is only going to make everything harder in the end, but I love you, Dorian. I love you too, Dorian said, and it was the first time he'd said those words out loud. The first time he'd admitted that feeling we'd both been carrying in silence. I love you, and I hate that I can't really have you. I hate that in the end I'm going to have to let you go and pretend you never meant anything. We kissed again, and this time it was different. It was desperate and intense, in a way that went beyond the physical. It was two people trying to engrave every second in permanent memory before everything disappeared. The night that followed was a mixture of passion and sadness, of stolen moments and promises we both knew we couldn't keep. And when we finally fell asleep intertwined with each other, I tried not to think about how many nights like this we still had left. The next morning, I woke up before him and lay there just watching Dorian sleep, memorizing every detail of his face relaxed by sleep, every line and every shadow, knowing that eventually these memories would be all I had left of him. He woke up finding my gaze fixed on him, and smiled in that small, intimate way that was reserved only for me. How long were you awake watching me? He asked, his voice husky with sleep. Not long enough, I replied honestly, because no matter how much time I had, it would never be enough when it came to him. I don't know. Everything seems too happy in our protagonists' lives. I think it's time to shake things up more, don't you think? Chapter 5. Greta confronts Angel.
I'm not afraid.
The next day started too normal to end the way it ended, and I should have noticed something was wrong in the air by how the morning had been too calm, as if the universe was holding its breath before releasing complete chaos. I spent the day working at the office on a design project that would normally have absorbed me, but my mind kept returning to Dorian and the night before, to the way he'd said he loved me and how those words had simultaneously healed and destroyed something inside me. It was almost 6 in the evening when I finally packed up my things and left the commercial building, my mind already planning a quiet night at home with a glass of wine and maybe a text conversation with Dorian if he could get a moment alone. That's when I saw the black car blocking my exit from the parking lot. A luxurious and intimidating sedan that I recognized immediately, even without ever having seen it before, because there was only one person who would have the audacity to ambush me this way. Greta Moreau stepped out of the back seat of the car as if she were making an entrance on a red carpet, all icy elegance and absolute control, wearing an impeccable white suit that probably cost more than my 3 months' rent. Her eyes met mine with calculated intensity, and I felt my stomach turn even as I forced my expression to remain neutral. Angel Sharman, Greta said, my name coming out of her mouth as if it were something unpleasant she needed to spit out. We need to talk. About what? I asked, crossing my arms and refusing to show the fear that was beginning to coil in my stomach like a snake ready to strike. About you staying away from Dorian, Greta replied with that sweet but deadly voice, walking closer with measured and deliberate steps, immediately and permanently. I don't know what I started, but she cut me off with a dismissive hand gesture. Don't lie to me, Greta said, stopping a few steps away and looking me up and down with obvious disdain. I know everything. Photos from the private investigator I hired, hotel records, everything. You've been at the Crown Hotel every Tuesday and Thursday for the last 3 weeks. She paused, letting that information hang in the air between us. You're his mistress. I decided there was no point denying it when she clearly had proof, so I just lifted my chin defiantly. So what? So what? Greta repeated, and for the first time I saw controlled fury beginning to crack that mask of perfect calm. So what that I'm his fiancée? The wedding is in 9 weeks, Angel. 9 weeks until I officially become Mrs. Esposito, while you'll be just a temporary distraction he forgot about. If I'm just a temporary distraction, I said, forcing my voice to come out stronger than I felt, then why are you here? Why bother with me? Greta's expression hardened even more, that cold and controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than if she were screaming. Because he's mine, she said, each word coming out loaded with possessiveness. Contract, alliance, family, all of this makes him mine. And you? You're nothing. Just a naive girl who thinks love conquers all when in our reality, power and business are the only things that matter. Then why worry about me if I'm nothing? I insisted, refusing to back down even when every instinct told me to run. Greta took another step closer, deliberately invading my personal space in an intimidating way. Because he looks at you differently, she admitted, and for the first time I saw something beyond anger in her eyes, something that almost looked like vulnerability before it quickly disappeared. And I don't accept that. Not when I've invested so much time and resources in this arrangement. She paused again, her eyes fixed on mine with absolute intensity. Stay away from him, Angel, or I'll tell your father. Richard Sharman wouldn't love knowing his daughter is getting involved with a mob boss, would he? I felt real fear hit me for the first time. That horrible awareness that she really could destroy my life with a simple conversation. You wouldn't do that, I said, but my voice trembled in a way that betrayed my uncertainty. Try me, Greta said simply, turning and walking back to the car with that absolute confidence of someone who knew they'd just won. You have 48 hours to break up with him. After that, I make a call to your father and watch your life crumble. The car left the parking lot, and I stood there alone trying to control the trembling in my hands while processing what had just happened. My fingers found the phone in my pocket before I could fully think about what I was doing, and I dialed Dorian's number with desperate urgency. Angel, his voice came from the other side, immediately alert. Is everything okay? No, I said, and my voice came out broken in a way I hated. Greta threatened me, Dorian. She said she'll tell my father if I don't break up with you. The silence on the other end lasted only a second before Dorian exploded with a fury I rarely heard from him. She did what? Where are you right now? Work parking lot, I replied, looking around as if Greta could come back any moment. She just left. Go home, Dorian ordered, and I could hear movement on the other end, as if he were already grabbing his car keys. Lock all the doors, and don't open for anyone but me. I'll handle this now. The call ended before I could respond, and I drove home in a state of stunned shock, my mind spinning with all the possible ways this could end, and none of them seemed good. I imagined what happened next based on what Dorian told me hours later. When he finally showed up at my door with an expression so dark, I knew immediately the news wasn't good. Dorian had gone straight to Greta's apartment, that luxurious penthouse in the city center that was decorated with the same calculated coldness that characterized its owner. Greta had opened the door expecting him, as if she knew he would come, and her expression was one of obvious satisfaction when she let him in. About time you showed up, she had said, pouring herself wine as if they were having a casual conversation. You threatened Angel, Dorian had said, without beating around the bush, barely contained fury in every word. Yes, Greta confirmed without hesitation, taking a sip of wine with deliberate calm. And I'll follow through on the threat if she doesn't stay away from you. You don't touch her, Dorian had said, taking a threatening step toward her, but Greta didn't back down even a millimeter. Or what? Greta challenged, putting the glass aside and crossing her arms. You cancel the wedding. Your family needs this alliance, Dorian. Without it, you lose territory. You lose contracts. You lose everything you've spent generations building. Are you really going to throw all that away for a girl? Dorian had fallen silent, and Greta had pressed the advantage she knew she had. So choose, she had said, her voice cold as ice. The alliance your family desperately needs, or your temporary mistress? Angel isn't my mistress, Dorian had said, his voice coming out tense with contained emotion. No? Greta had asked, raising a perfectly drawn eyebrow. Then what exactly is she to you? There was a long pause before Dorian answered, and when he finally spoke, the words had come out loaded with brutal honesty. Everything. She's everything to me. Greta had laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor at all. And yet you're going to marry me, she had said, walking until she was face to face with him. Because you have to marry me. Because you have no choice. So stay away from her, Dorian, or I'll destroy her in ways that will make you regret ever meeting her. Dorian had stood there, and I could perfectly imagine the torture happening inside him, the war between what he wanted and what he knew he had to do. "Okay," he had finally said, defeat weighing in every letter. "I'll stay away from her, but you promise to leave Angel alone. Promise you won't tell her father, that you won't do anything to hurt her." "I promise," Greta had agreed, obvious satisfaction in her voice. "If you keep your part." "I will," Dorian had said, and those 2 words had sealed our fate in a way neither of us was prepared to face. When Dorian told me all this in my living room a few hours later, I saw the pain in his eyes and knew what was coming before he even said the words. "I need to break up with you," he said, and each word sounded like it was being torn from him by force. "To protect you, to keep you safe, I need to let you go." And so, with 9 weeks still left until the wedding, our time together had ended before we could even fully enjoy it. Chapter 6. Dorian breaks up.
Don't walk away.
I have to.
Protection. We sat in silence in my living room for a long moment after he told me about the conversation with Greta, and I could feel the weight of those unspoken words hanging in the air between us like a death sentence. Dorian was sitting beside me on the couch, but he seemed miles away, that tortured expression on his face telling me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Angel, we need to break up," Dorian finally said, turning to face me with eyes that carried so much pain it made me want to look away, but I forced myself to keep staring. The word left my mouth before I could fully process what he'd just said. "What? Greta's going to destroy you," Dorian continued, his hands closing into fists on his own knees, as if he were physically fighting against himself. "She's going to tell your father about us. She's going to ruin your life, your relationship with your family, everything you have, and I can't allow that to happen. I won't let you suffer the consequences of being with me." I felt something break inside my chest, that sharp and devastating pain that comes when you realize you're losing something precious, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. "Then we fight," I said, my voice coming out louder than I intended, almost desperate. "Together, Dorian. We face Greta, we face the families, we face whatever comes." "Fight against what exactly?" Dorian asked, and there was a desperate frustration in his voice that matched mine. "Against entire families? Against years of tradition and alliances and power? Angel, you'd lose everything. Your father would disown you the second he found out about us. Your family would cut you off completely. You'd lose the entire life you know." "I don't care," I shouted, tears finally starting to fall down my face without me being able to control them. "I don't care about money or inheritance or what my father thinks. I love you. That's all that matters." Dorian closed his eyes as if my words had caused him physical pain, and when he opened them again there were tears there too. And seeing Dorian Esposito cry was one of the most devastating things I'd ever witnessed because he never cried, never let anyone see that vulnerability. "And I love you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love someone, and that's exactly why I need to break up with you, to protect you from everything that being with me would inevitably bring." He paused, taking a deep breath as if preparing for the next words. "Please, Angel, accept this. Pretend it never happened, that these last months were just a dream, and move on with your life." "How do I pretend?" I asked, my voice coming out broken between sobs I couldn't control anymore. "How do I pretend after everything that happened between us? After every kiss, every conversation, every moment where you made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered?" Dorian got up from the couch as if he could no longer stay still, walking to the window and resting his forehead on the cold glass. "You're strong, Angel," he said without turning to look at me, as if facing my pain was more than he could bear. "You're stronger than I'll ever be. You can survive this. You can move on and find someone who can really give you the future you deserve." I got up too, walking to him and touching his back with trembling hands. "What if I don't want another future? What if the only future I can imagine is one that has you in it?" Dorian finally turned, and the pain on his face was a perfect mirror of mine. He raised his hands and held my face with that gentleness that always completely disarmed me, his thumbs wiping away the tears that kept falling without stopping. "Then you're going to need to learn to imagine a different one," he said softly. And then he leaned in and kissed my forehead with a tenderness that made my heart shatter into a million pieces. "Goodbye, Angel," Dorian whispered against my skin. And then he pulled away, releasing my face and walking toward the door without looking back, because if he looked, I knew he wouldn't actually be able to leave. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded as final as a gunshot, and I collapsed right there in the middle of the living room, falling to my knees as violent sobs tore through my throat. I don't know how long I stayed there crying, but when I could finally move again, the light outside had changed, and my cheeks were rough with dried tears. The days that followed were the worst of my life, and that includes when I broke my arm at 10, and when I lost my grandmother at 15. Every morning I woke up with that stupid hope that maybe it had all been just a horrible nightmare, and then reality would hit me like a truck, and I'd have to force myself out of bed and pretend I was functional when all I wanted was to disappear. Henry and Deb took turns showing up at my apartment unannounced, bringing food I barely touched, and company I appreciated even when I couldn't express it. It was 2 weeks of absolute misery before Henri finally decided intervention was necessary, showing up at my door on a Thursday night with that determined expression that meant he was about to say something I probably didn't want to hear. "Girl, enough," Henry said without preamble, marching into the apartment and pulling me from the couch where I'd spent the last 3 hours staring at the wall. "You need to fight for him. He broke up with me to protect me, Henry," I said, my voice coming out monotone and lifeless. "How exactly do I fight against that? Against someone trying to keep me safe? By showing you don't need protection," Henry replied, shaking me lightly by the shoulders. "By showing you choose him, that you're willing to face the consequences because your love is worth more than anything you could lose." Deb was standing near the door, and she sighed in that way that told me she and Henri had already discussed this before coming here. "Angel, I understand you're suffering," she said carefully, "but Henri has a point. If you really love Dorian, if you really believe you should be together, then you can't just accept the breakup and move on. So what do you think I should do?" I asked, feeling the first spark of something besides despair starting to emerge in my chest. Henri smiled in that conspiratorial way I knew so well. "Interrupt the wedding," he said simply, dramatic, public, in front of everyone. "You walk into that church and tell the truth about what you and Dorian have, about how much you love each other, and give him the choice he deserves to have. That's completely insane," Deb commented, but there was a note of consideration in her voice that told me she was at least thinking about the possibility. "It's perfect," Henri corrected, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "It's grand and dramatic and exactly the kind of gesture that shows you're serious." I stayed silent for a long moment, processing the idea that was absolutely crazy and potentially disastrous in every possible way, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made sense, the only way to show Dorian that I chose him, despite all the consequences, that I was willing to risk everything for the love we shared. "Okay," I finally said, feeling something like determination starting to replace the despair that had consumed me for the last 2 weeks. "I'm going to do it. I'm going to interrupt the wedding and give Dorian the chance to really choose, without threats or pressure or family obligations." Henri pulled me into a tight hug, and even Deb smiled despite the obvious reservations she still had. "This is going to be epic," Henri said with satisfaction, and I couldn't help but smile too for the first time in weeks, even if it was a small and shaky smile. Epic or disastrous, I thought. But either way, it would be honest. It would be real, and it would be the last chance I had to fight for the man I loved more than anything in the world. So, viewer, do you think it'll be epic or disastrous? Which character do you agree with? Well, either way, we'll find out together soon. Chapter 7. Wedding and Interruption.
I choose you.
The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of meticulous preparation and absolute panic, and I oscillated between unwavering certainty that I was doing the right thing and paralyzing terror that I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. Henri had become my official dramatic operations planner, researching details about the ceremony with the dedication of a professional spy, while Deb alternated between supporting me and reminding me of all the possible ways this could go terribly wrong. The church was huge and opulent in a way only the Mafia elite could appreciate. All white marble and expensive stained glass that threw patterns of colored light through the interior space. I was hidden in the back with Henri and Deb beside me, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my own ears, my eyes fixed on the altar where Dorian stood with an expression so miserable it hurt to look at him even from far away. "Are you sure?" Henri whispered in my ear for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, and I could hear the concern mixed with excitement in his voice. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied, and it was absolute truth, even when my hands trembled so much I had to interlock my fingers to hide it. Greta was walking down the center aisle at that moment, all dressed in white and radiating victory and satisfaction in a way that made my anger boil in my chest. She looked like a queen marching to her coronation, completely confident she was about to get exactly what she wanted, and something fierce and protective inside me roared in defiance. The priest was at the altar waiting, and I could see the Esposito family in the front rows, all impeccably dressed and looking forward with expressions that varied between approval and resignation. My family wasn't there, of course, because officially I'd never been known as having any connection to Dorian Esposito, and that was a mixture of relief and sadness, because it meant I wouldn't have to see the disappointment on my father's face the moment I did what I was about to do. Greta reached the altar, and stood beside Dorian, and even from where I was, I could see how tense he was, as if every muscle in his body was fighting against being there. The priest began the ceremony with those traditional words I'd heard at dozens of weddings before, but this time each syllable seemed loaded with weight and meaning that went far beyond the normal ritual. My heart was in my throat as I waited, knowing I had only one moment, only one chance to make this work, or fail spectacularly. "If anyone here present has any objection to the matrimony of these two," the priest said, his voice echoing through the vast space of the church, "speak now or forever hold your peace." I took a deep breath, feeling Henri squeeze my hand encouragingly, and then my voice came out much louder and clearer than I thought would be possible considering the terror I was feeling. "I do." The silence that settled in the church was so complete, you could hear a pin drop, and then it was as if everyone had turned at the same time to look at me. Hundreds of eyes fixed on me as I started walking down the aisle toward the altar. Dorian turned with a speed that should have been impossible for someone in a state of shock, and I saw the exact moment he recognized me, saw his face go from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Angel?" My name came out of his mouth as if he couldn't believe I was really there, as if I were a hallucination that could disappear any second. I kept walking, forcing my steps to remain steady even when my knees threatened to shake, and when I got close enough to the altar to clearly see everyone's expressions, I stopped and turned my attention completely to Dorian, ignoring everyone else. "Sorry to interrupt," I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady, "but I have a very serious objection to this wedding." Greta exploded beside me, her voice coming out in a shrill scream of barely controlled fury. "Who the hell do you think you are?" I completely ignored her, keeping my eyes fixed on Dorian, as if he were the only person in the universe who mattered, because in that moment, he really was. "Dorian, you told me you love me," I said, feeling tears starting to form but refusing to let them fall yet. "And then you sent me away saying it was to protect me. But I don't want protection. I never wanted protection. I just want you." I paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I know this is completely crazy. I know our families are going to hate us. I know you'll probably lose this alliance everyone thinks is so important. But I love you, Dorian. I love you so much I can't imagine a future where you're not in it. And I couldn't stay home knowing you were here getting married to someone else without at least trying, without at least giving you the chance to really choose." Dorian was completely still, looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully decipher, and the silence stretched for so long I started to feel panic rising up my throat. Maybe I'd calculated everything wrong. Maybe he really had moved on. Maybe... "Dorian, make her leave immediately," Greta ordered, turning to him with absolute fury stamped on her face. "This is our wedding. Our alliance. She has no right to be here." Dorian looked at Greta, then returned his gaze to me, and when he spoke his voice was loaded with something that sounded dangerously close to relief. "I can't." "What?" Greta practically screamed, taking a step toward him as if she were about to physically grab him. Dorian looked at me again, and this time I saw a small smile starting to form on his lips, the first real smile I'd seen on him in weeks. "You're crazy," he said, but it didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like admiration mixed with disbelief. "Completely, absolutely crazy." "I am," I agreed, feeling my own smile starting to appear through the tears. "I'm crazy about you." Dorian looked at Greta one more time, and then began loosening his tie with deliberate movements, taking it off completely, and throwing it on the floor in a gesture that was as symbolic as it was practical. "Sorry, Greta," he said, and there was a firmness in his voice that left no room for argument. "But I can't marry you when I'm completely in love with someone else." He descended the altar steps, walking straight to me, and chaos began to explode around us when the reality of what was happening started to settle in on the congregation. Greta was screaming something I couldn't fully process, and the Esposito family was standing with expressions varying from shock to fury, but none of that mattered, because Dorian was standing in front of me with that intense look that always made me feel like I was the only person in the world. "Sorry," Dorian said, loud enough for everyone to hear, turning partially to face his family without completely releasing my gaze. "But I choose her. Even if it costs the alliance, even if it costs territory or power or whatever else you think I'm throwing away, I choose Angel." He turned completely to me then, his hands coming up to hold my face with that gentleness that completely contrasted with the chaos happening around us. "This is going to be hard," he warned, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "My family's going to fight against this. Your family's going to freak out when they find out. We're going to have a lot of problems ahead." "I know," I said, my own hands coming up to cover his. "But together," Dorian confirmed, that smile growing until it became something radiant and true. "Always together, no matter what comes." And then he kissed me right there at the altar, in front of God and the Mafia elite, and furious Greta, and his shocked family. And it was the most perfect kiss of my life because it wasn't secret, or hidden, or loaded with guilt. It was honest and public, and an absolute declaration that we chose each other despite everything against us. When we finally pulled apart, the church was in complete chaos. Greta had turned and was marching down the aisle toward the exit, screaming something about how the Moreau family would never forget this humiliation. The Esposito family was divided between those who seemed furious and those who seemed strangely relieved, as if they'd been waiting for something like this to happen. Henri was dramatically applauding from the back of the church, tears running down his face, while Deb just smiled and shook her head with that expression of, "I can't believe this actually happened." Dorian intertwined his fingers with mine, squeezing my hand hard enough for me to know this was real, that he was really choosing to stay with me. "Ready to face the consequences?" he asked quietly, and I could see the concern mixed with happiness in his eyes. "More than ready," I replied, and it was completely true, "as long as it's with you." And then we walked together down the church aisle, hand in hand and completely united, leaving that place toward an uncertain future, but at least a future we'd face side by side. Well, that was epic and disastrous and romantic and chaotic all at the same time, and the best part is it's not over yet. Chapter 8: Consequences and Family.
He's my choice.
The days following the wedding interruption were a brutal roller coaster of emotions that alternated between absolute euphoria at finally being with Dorian openly and paralyzing terror about all the consequences that were just beginning to manifest. The first and most immediate consequence came in the form of a tense meeting between Dorian and his family, a conversation he told me about later with that dark expression that told me it had been as bad as we expected. The Moreau family had cut all ties with the Espositos immediately after the public humiliation of the canceled wedding, and with that rupture came the loss of significant territory the alliance would have guaranteed, contracts that disappeared overnight, and a general reduction in the power and influence the Esposito family had spent generations carefully building. Dorian told me all this while we were sitting in his apartment a few days later, his voice calm but loaded with weight, as he described exactly how much his choice had cost the family. "They're furious," Dorian said, his hand intertwined with mine in a way that told me he was seeking comfort as much as offering it. "My father can barely look at me. My uncles are talking about removing me from leadership positions, and half the family thinks I've completely lost my mind." I felt guilt tighten in my chest, that horrible awareness that my presence in his life had caused all that destruction. "Do you regret it?" I asked, forcing myself to face him even with fear of the answer. "Choosing me instead of the alliance?" Dorian turned to look at me with that intensity that always left me breathless, and then he took my hand and placed it over his heart, where I could feel the strong and steady beats. "Not for a second," he said with absolute conviction. "I'd lose everything again 1,000 times if it meant being able to be with you for real, without secrets or hiding or guilt." But while Dorian was dealing with the consequences in his family, I knew it was only a matter of time before my own father found out about what I'd done, and when that moment finally came, it was as devastating as I'd imagined it would be. The photos from the wedding had leaked, of course, because events of that magnitude with that level of scandal never remained private, and within a few days the images of me interrupting the ceremony were circulating on gossip sites and social media that my father occasionally monitored. The call came on a Thursday morning when I was at Dorian's apartment trying to help him organize some business documents, and my father's name flashing on the phone screen made my stomach drop in a way that left me momentarily paralyzed. Dorian saw my expression and immediately understood, coming to me and placing his hand on my shoulder in silent support while I answered the call with trembling hands. "You did what?" My father's voice exploded through the phone before I could even say hello, and the volume and fury in it made me physically recoil, even knowing he was on the other side of the city. "Dad, I can explain," I started, but he immediately cut me off with that authority he rarely used, but that always made me feel like I was 10 years old again. "You interrupted Dorian Esposito's wedding?" Richard continued, and I could hear the disbelief mixed with anger in his voice. "The mob boss? Angel? Are you completely insane?" I took a deep breath, trying to find courage that seemed to have abandoned me completely. "I love him, Dad," I said, and my voice came out much weaker than I wanted. "You barely know him," Richard retorted, and I could perfectly imagine the way he was pacing back and forth in his office, that gesture he always made when he was truly furious. "And he's a criminal, Angel. You know that, right? You know the man you just destroyed your reputation for is literally a mob boss? He's not." I started to protest, but my father cut me off again. "Yes, he is," Richard practically shouted, his voice rising in a way I rarely heard. "I don't care what facade of respectable businessman he maintains. Everyone who matters knows exactly who and what Dorian Esposito really is. And you, My daughter, just publicly associated yourself with him in a way that can't be undone. There was a pause where I could hear my father breathing heavily, trying to control himself, and when he spoke again, his voice had become colder and more controlled in a way that was somehow worse than the shouting. "You're cut off," he said, each word coming out precise and deliberate. "No inheritance. No access to family funds, no place in the company. All of that disappears until you break up with him and come back to reality." I felt tears starting to stream down my face, but at the same time something fierce and determined solidified in my chest, that absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice even if it cost everything. "Then goodbye, Dad," I said, my voice coming out surprisingly firm despite the tears. "Because I'm not breaking up with him. Not now and not ever." I hung up before he could respond, the phone falling from my hand as sobs began to tear through my throat, and Dorian immediately pulled me into his arms, holding me tight, while I collapsed against his chest. He didn't say anything, just held me and let me cry, one hand stroking my hair while murmuring soft words of comfort I could barely process through the pain. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but eventually my tears diminished until they became just occasional sobs, and that's when my phone rang again, making us both look at the screen with apprehension. But this time, it wasn't my father, it was my mother, and something about the way her name appeared gave me a small spark of hope I didn't even know I was still feeling. "Angel," Margaret's voice came softly when I answered, so different from my father's fury. It almost made me start crying again. "Your mother here, dear. Your father is furious, as you can probably imagine, but I needed to call and talk to you." "Mom," I started, but my voice failed and I had to clear my throat before continuing. "I know I disappointed you and Dad. I know that. You didn't disappoint me," Margaret interrupted gently, and the sincerity in her voice caught me completely off guard. "I understand, Angel. Love makes us do crazy things, things that don't make sense to anyone else, but make all the sense in the world to us." She paused, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. "Just tell me one thing. Are you sure? Absolutely sure he's what you want, even with everything you're losing?" "I am, Mom," I replied without hesitation, looking at Dorian, who was sitting beside me holding my free hand. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." There was another silence, and then Margaret spoke again with that firmness I recognized from important moments of my childhood. "Then I support you," she said simply. "It'll have to be in secret. Your father can't know I'm on your side in this, or he'll cut me off too. But I support you, Angel, completely." The tears came back, but this time they were relief mixed with overwhelming gratitude, that awareness that I hadn't lost everything, even though I'd lost so much. "Thank you, Mom," I managed to say through renewed sobs. "Thank you for understanding." "Always, dear," Margaret said with that maternal tone that always made me feel safe no matter how old I got. "Just promise me you'll be careful, that you'll protect yourself. The world Dorian lives in is dangerous in ways I don't even like to imagine." "I promise," I said, and it was a promise I intended to keep, because now that I finally had Dorian for real, I wasn't going to let anything separate us again. Chapter 9. Rebuilding Together.
We built this.
6 months had passed since that chaotic day at the church, and I still woke up some mornings not fully believing that all of it had really happened, that Dorian and I were really together openly and officially without needing to hide from anyone. We were living in his apartment now, that luxurious space in the city center that had gradually been gaining my touches scattered throughout every corner, my plants on the balcony mixed with his masculine and minimalist furniture, my books occupying half the bookshelf that before only had volumes about business and strategy. Life had settled into a new normalcy that was simultaneously harder and more rewarding than I could have imagined. Dorian was rebuilding his empire without the Moreau alliance, and surprisingly, he was discovering there was an unexpected freedom in not being tied to contracts and obligations that had been imposed by previous generations. He did business differently now, more carefully perhaps, but also more authentically, building alliances based on mutual respect, instead of arranged marriages and outdated traditions. I had started working as a freelance designer after I lost access to family funds, and although the money was significantly less than I was used to, there was genuine satisfaction in knowing that every cent I earned came from my own work and talent. Dorian had offered to finance everything countless times, but I had firmly refused because I needed to prove to myself that I could survive without the safety net my family had always provided. I needed to know I had chosen Dorian out of love and not financial necessity. We were happy in a deep and real way, but that didn't mean everything was perfect or easy. There were days when the consequences of our choices weighed more than on others. Days when Dorian came home tense and silent after difficult meetings with associates who still questioned his decisions. Or days when I saw something that reminded me of my father, and felt that sharp pain of loss even knowing it had been my choice to cut that tie. It was on a Saturday afternoon in October that Henri and Deb showed up unannounced. bringing wine and that chaotic energy that always transformed any gathering into something memorable. Henri had invaded the apartment with his characteristic enthusiasm, throwing himself on the couch as if he owned the place, while Deb followed behind with an amused and slightly exasperated expression. "So?" Henri asked without preamble, looking between me and Dorian with that conspiratorial smile. "You two finally really official? Like living together, sharing a closet, arguing about who left the toilet seat up?" I laughed, snuggling closer against Dorian's side on the couch. "Very official," I confirmed, feeling his arm automatically come around my shoulders in that way that had become as natural as breathing. "And your family, Dorian?" Deb asked more cautiously, always the most sensitive to the complicated dynamics surrounding our relationship. "How are they dealing with everything after these months?" Dorian considered the question for a moment, his fingers tracing distracted patterns on my shoulder while formulating the answer. "Eventually they accepted it," he said, and there was a note of surprise in his voice, as if he still didn't fully believe it. "It took time, many difficult conversations, and some memorable shouting, but they realized I'm stronger now than I was when I was stuck in a forced alliance." He paused, looking at me with that soft expression that always made my heart race. "And with her by my side, I can face anything." Henri dramatically placed his hand over his heart, pretending to be on the verge of tears. "This is so beautiful, I can't stand it. And you, girl? Your dad still being a complete stubborn idiot?" I sighed, feeling that familiar pang of sadness mixed with frustration. "My dad still doesn't talk to me," I admitted, forcing my voice to remain neutral even when it hurt to acknowledge. "But my mom visits in secret when he's traveling on business. She brings news, tells me how things are, and keeps that connection alive even though it has to be hidden from him." "Love wins," Henri declared with absolute conviction, raising his wine glass in an impromptu toast. "I always knew it. From the first day I saw you two dancing at that club with all that palpable tension, I knew eventually love would win over all the absurd complications." Deb rolled her eyes but smiled, and we toasted together there in the living room, celebrating not just what we'd conquered, but also everything we'd survived to get there. The conversation flowed easily after that, Henri telling ridiculous stories about his latest romantic disasters while Deb commented with dry humor, and for the first time in months, I felt like everything really was going to be okay, like we'd finally reached the other side of all the turbulence. But it was almost a year later, on a rainy September afternoon, I'll never forget, that the reconciliation I'd stopped expecting finally happened in such an unexpected way. It left me completely unprepared. I was working at home on a particularly complicated design project when the doorbell rang, and when I opened the door without thinking much about who it could be, I almost fell backwards in shock seeing my father standing there in the hallway. Richard Sharman was visibly uncomfortable, his hands in his pockets, and an expression on his face I'd never seen before, something between regret and determination. We stood there for a long moment, just staring at each other, an entire year of silence and hurt hanging in the air between us like a physical barrier. "Dad," I finally managed to say, my voice coming out much weaker than I wanted. "Angel," he replied, and just that, just hearing him say my name after so long, was almost enough to make me start crying. "Can I come in?" I moved away from the door in a mute gesture of permission, watching as he entered the apartment I shared with Dorian, his eyes scanning the space as if cataloging every detail. We sat in the living room, that uncomfortable silence stretching until he finally took a deep breath and spoke. "I still think you're crazy," Richard began, and those words so typical of him almost made me smile despite the tension. "Completely and absolutely crazy for throwing everything away for a relationship that seemed impossible in every way." He paused, looking directly at me. "But you seem happy, Angel. Genuinely happy in a way I haven't seen in you for years." I felt tears starting to form, that overwhelming emotion of finally having my father acknowledge my choice, even if he still didn't completely agree. "I am happy, Dad," I said honestly. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be." Richard nodded slowly, processing that, and then asked the question I could see was tormenting him. "And Dorian, does he treat you well? Does he make you feel valued and respected? Better than anyone ever has?" I replied without hesitation, feeling that absolute certainty that came from knowing someone as deeply as I knew Dorian. "He makes me feel like I'm the most important thing in his universe, like nothing else matters as much as my happiness." That's when Dorian came home, opening the door and immediately stopping when he saw Richard sitting in our living room. That moment of absolute tension where the two men measured each other in silence before any words were spoken. Dorian recovered first, closing the door behind him and walking inside with that controlled confidence he always carried, extending his hand to my father in a gesture that was simultaneously respectful and defiant. "Mr. Sharman," Dorian said, and there was caution in his voice, but also firmness. Richard looked at the extended hand for a long moment before finally shaking it, and then he looked Dorian directly in the eyes with that intensity I knew so well. "You hurt her?" my father said, each word loaded with serious threat. "Even if you're a mob boss or whatever you are, I'll kill you." You can be sure of that. Dorian didn't back down even a centimeter, holding Richard's gaze with respect, but without submission. Fair, he agreed, and there was raw honesty in his voice. But I'll never hurt her, Mr. Sharman. She's everything to me. The only thing that matters more than business or power or anything else I have in life. I saw something change in my father's expression, that final resistance starting to dissolve as he processed Dorian's words and the obvious sincerity behind them. He stayed silent for another long moment, and then finally nodded once. Decisive. Okay, Richard said, and that simple word carried so much weight it almost took my breath away. I accept. Not completely, not yet, but I accept that you're together and that this apparently won't change. He looked at Dorian again, that last layer of protective father still firmly in place. But you take care of her, understood? You keep her safe in this dangerous world you live in, or you'll have to answer to me. Always, Dorian promised, coming to where I was sitting and placing his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. I'll take care of her for the rest of my life, that I can guarantee. And so, with that tense but necessary conversation, the last piece finally fell into place. The last connection I thought I'd lost forever being carefully repaired. It wasn't perfect. My father still had obvious reservations, and probably always would, but it was acceptance. It was recognition that I had made my choice, and that choice had been the right one for me. After my father left, promising to return for dinner in a few weeks and officially bringing my mother this time, I turned to Dorian and finally let the tears I'd been holding fall freely. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tight while I cried against his chest. Tears of relief and gratitude and love so immense it seemed impossible to contain. Everything's complete now, I murmured against him when I could finally speak again. We have each other, we have our friends, and now I have my family back. At least partly. We have everything that matters, Dorian agreed, kissing the top of my head with that tenderness reserved only for me, and we'll build even more from here. Chapter 10. Promise fulfilled and new threat.
This isn't over.
2 years had passed since that tense day when my father showed up at the apartment, and if someone had told me 3 years ago that I'd be here today, living with Dorian and genuinely happy in a way that seemed to have come straight out of an unlikely fairy tale, I probably would have laughed in that person's face. But here we were, stronger than ever, having survived everything the universe had thrown our way, and still managing to build something beautiful and real from the ashes of everything we'd lost. Eclipse had become our special place in a strange way, that club where everything had started that night so long ago when I'd worn a green dress and deliberately provoked a man I had no right to want. Dorian was organizing a reopening anniversary party for the club after extensive renovations, and when Henri had suggested with that mischievous smile, I knew meant trouble that I should wear that dress again, I couldn't resist the temptation. The emerald green dress still fit perfectly, hugging my curves exactly the same way it had done years ago. And when I entered the club with Henri and Deb by my side, I felt that same wave of confidence and power the fabric always gave me. The difference was that this time I wasn't provoking to see if I could get Dorian's attention. I was provoking because I knew exactly the effect it would cause on him, and loved every second of it. Dorian was near the bar talking with some associates when he saw me, and the moment his eyes landed on me was absolutely delicious to witness. He stopped mid-sentence, his expression changing from professional to something that was pure masculine intensity, mixed with that small and dangerous smile I knew so well. He excused himself from the associates and started walking in my direction with that determination that always made my heart race. "Are you testing my promise?" Dorian asked, when he got close enough, his eyes scanning the dress with obvious appreciation, while that smile grew. I tilted my head with false innocence, delighting in the game that had never lost its shine even after all this time. "What promise?" Dorian came even closer, his hands finding my waist in that gesture that had become so familiar and comforting over the years. Possessive but loving in a way that always made me feel completely safe and desired at the same time. "If I catch you wearing this dress again," he said, his voice low and husky near my ear, "I'll rip it off you with my teeth." I laughed, that sound that was part provocation and part pure happiness, leaning closer to him. "And are you going to follow through?" "Absolutely," Dorian promised, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that still had the power to make my entire world stop, even after hundreds of other kisses, but not here, at home, where I can take my time and do it right. He pulled away just enough to look into my eyes, that intensity reserved only for me shining there. "You're mine, Angel, forever, forever," I agreed, feeling that familiar warmth spread through my chest, that absolute certainty that I'd made all the right choices to get to this moment. The moment was so perfect it should have alerted me that something was about to go wrong, because perfect moments never lasted without interruption in the kind of life Dorian led. That's when I saw one of Dorian's guards running in our direction, with an expression of absolute urgency that immediately transformed the entire atmosphere around us, from celebratory to tense. "Boss!" the guard practically shouted when he got close enough, completely out of breath in a way that told me he'd run from somewhere distant. "We have a serious problem." Dorian turned to him instantly, his posture changing from relaxed lover to alert mob boss in a matter of seconds. "What problem?" he asked, his voice coming out controlled but loaded with tension. The guard looked at me quickly before returning his attention to Dorian, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Greta Moreau's back in the city, boss, and she's not alone this time. She brought allies, heavy hitters from other families she convinced to unite against you." I felt Dorian freeze beside me, that kind of absolute stillness that came before an explosion of action. And when I looked at his face, I saw something I rarely saw there, something that looked dangerously close to real fear. "Shit," he murmured, his hand squeezing my waist almost painfully, before he realized and loosened slightly. "What does this mean?" I asked, feeling fear starting to coil in my stomach even without fully understanding the extent of the threat. Dorian turned to look at me, and the expression on his face made my heart sink completely. "It means the past came back," he said, each word coming out loaded with weight. "And this time Greta doesn't just want to destroy me or recover the alliance she lost." He paused, his hands coming up to hold my face with that gentleness that completely contrasted with the fear in his eyes. "This time she wants you, Angel. She wants to hurt you as a way to hurt me." I held his hands, refusing to let fear paralyze me even when it was definitely present. "Then we face it together," I said with all the firmness I could muster. "The same way we faced everything else that tried to separate us. Together," Dorian agreed, and then turned to the guard with that expression of absolute command. "Gather everyone now, all the men we have available. The war has officially started." The guard nodded and started to walk away, but then turned again, as if he'd forgotten to mention something important. "Boss, there's one more thing," he said hesitantly. "Mrs. Moreau isn't alone behind the scenes. She has someone with her, someone unexpected." "Who?" Dorian asked, impatience clear in his voice. That's when I saw, through the crowd that was starting to disperse, sensing the tension in the air, a familiar figure walking beside Greta Moreau toward the VIP area of the club. My heart literally stopped beating when I recognized the face, when I processed the impossibility of what my eyes were seeing. "My father," I whispered, absolute shock making my voice come out completely powerless. "What is my father doing with her?" Dorian followed my gaze, and I saw the exact moment he processed the same impossible sight. Richard Sharman walking side by side with Greta Moreau as if they were allies, as if the last 2 years of careful reconciliation had never happened. Dorian's expression darkened in a way I'd never seen, that cold and calculated fury taking over completely. "Looks like your father decided he still wants to separate us," Dorian said, his voice coming out so icy it made me shiver, "and found the perfect ally to make that happen. Hello, dear ones. This is Lena, and I need to say something. You have no idea how many times I rewrote the green dress scene before I was satisfied. Angel and Dorian appeared in my head during a sleepless dawn, and since then they haven't left me alone, demanding I tell their story in the most intense way possible. The hardest chapter was definitely 6, when Dorian breaks up with Angel to protect her. I cried writing it because I understand that pain of loving someone so much you're willing to let them go. And the wedding interruption? I wrote it listening to dramatic music on repeat until I could capture exactly that now or never tension. Greta was inspired by all the elegant and dangerous villainesses who have always fascinated me, while Henri is basically the best imaginary friend I could think of. And if you want to see another story you'll love, click on the video that appears now on your screen.